1 minute before the gavel came down, the most important crypto bill in American history did not have the votes. What happened in the next 60 seconds rewrote the timeline for every financial institution still waiting on the sidelines. Staffers were handwriting amendments in real time. Lawmakers were negotiating in a side room while the hearing had already been called to order in the main chamber next door. The most consequential piece of crypto legislation in American history was being held together by ink and improvisation in the final seconds before the vote it had spent 4 months waiting for. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened inside that hearing room and what it actually means for the thesis you have been holding. Before we get into the details, did you know this vote nearly collapsed entirely the night before? Drop a yes or a no in the comments right now. This is not financial advice. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. Always do your own research before making any financial decisions. If this kind of deep regulatory coverage is useful to you, the analysis that most financial media never gets to, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach more people who genuinely need to see this. But this is the part almost nobody understands. The bill at the center of all of this is called the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act. Before explaining the drama inside Thursday's hearing, you need to understand what this legislation actually does, because its name is repeated so often that the substance behind it gets lost in the noise. Think of the Clarity Act as the first comprehensive legal rulebook for the entire U.S. digital asset industry, not just for crypto as an investment vehicle, for the full ecosystem, the businesses that store digital assets, the exchanges that trade them, every financial institution that wants to touch this technology legally inside the United States. Right now, that ecosystem operates in a legal gray zone. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the two federal agencies that oversee financial markets, have had competing and often conflicting views on which digital assets fall under which regulator's authority. That ambiguity is not a technical footnote. It is the primary reason major financial institutions, banks, payment processors, and fintech companies have held back from integrating digital assets into their core business. The Clarity Act is designed to resolve that ambiguity by writing clear rules into federal statute, and that distinction matters more than most coverage acknowledges. And this is where the story becomes dangerous. Michael Seelig, who is connected to the bill's advancement in the Senate, made this point directly. Without legislation, any clarity the current administration has created can be reversed the moment a future administration appoints different agency directors. A regulatory position can be undone with a memo. A law takes an act of Congress to change. The difference between what the current SEC and CFTC have said and what a federal statute would codify is the difference between temporary comfort and permanent structural clarity. That is why financial institutions have been waiting specifically for legislation. Not for regulatory speeches, not for agency interpretations, for law. And that brings us to what actually happened on Thursday morning. Because the legislation that institutions have been waiting on for 2 years almost didn't survive the 12 hours leading up to its vote. The night before the hearing, negotiations between Senate Banking Committee Republicans and Democrats broke down. Both sides had made what people close to the talks described as significant progress on the most politically sensitive section of the bill. A set of ethics provisions that would prohibit government officials from launching or financially benefiting from crypto projects while they hold public office. The political weight behind that provision is obvious to anyone who has been following related news. But despite progress on that question, the talks stalled when the conversation shifted to a different part of the bill. The Blockchain Regulatory Clarity Act, a separate piece of legislation designed to protect software developers who build non-custodial applications from being prosecuted under money transmitter laws, became the new sticking point. Non-custodial means the developer never holds the user's assets directly. Republicans were not willing to accept proposed changes to how that protection was written. Talks ended without a deal. Now here's where things get serious. That same Wednesday evening, the 5 pro-crypto Democrats on the Banking Committee held a private meeting in Senator Mark Warner's office. The group included Warner himself, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, Senator Raphael Warnock, Senator Angela Alsobrooks, and Senator Ruben Gallego. They discussed strategy for what was now looking like a difficult morning. When members arrived at the Dirksen Senate office building by 10:30 a.m. for the scheduled hearing, they were still working through the problem. As late as 10:29 a.m., 1 minute before Banking Committee Chairman Tim Scott called the hearing to order, the votes were not secured. A Banking Committee staffer who witnessed what came next described it as pretty unbelievable. Right after Senator Elizabeth Warren, the ranking member of the committee, finished her opening statement, The temperature in the room began to shift. A small bipartisan group retreated to a space adjacent to the main hearing chamber known as the anteroom. That group included Senator Tom Tillis, Senator Cynthia Lummis, Senator Angela Alsobrooks, and Senator Ruben Gallego. Their staff were handwriting draft statements and amendment language on the spot, printing updated materials, rushing documents into members' hands in real time, while the formal hearing proceeded in the room next door. Other staffers described the scene as chaotic and unprecedented. It was one of the more unusual days in the Senate Banking Committee's recent history by the account of people who were there. Because once you understand what was being handwritten in the side room, while the cameras were focused on the hearing chamber, you realize this bill didn't pass by design. It survived by improvisation, and what happens next changes everything. The deal they reached included revisions to 5 proposed amendments. One significant revision removed language from Section 301 of the bill that had referenced the Blockchain Regulatory Clarity Act, specifically in Section 604. That removal has since generated concern among advocates for decentralized finance, who argue the change could strip away important legal protections for software developers as the bill moves forward. Additional revisions in the deal included language explicitly authorizing banks and credit unions to engage in digital asset activities, a provision related to tokenization, a ban on insider trading involving auxiliary assets as defined in the bill, and language preserving state-level consumer protection laws. All of those amendments were added back into the voting lineup at Chairman Scott's direction. The final vote was 15-9 in favor, with Senators Alsobrooks and Gallego crossing the aisle to join every Republican on the committee. That bipartisan margin changes the trajectory of the bill, not because 15-9 is a dominant majority, but because a strictly party line result, with all Republicans voting yes and all Democrats no, would have cast a shadow over the bill's path in the full Senate. Bipartisan support at the committee level signals to the broader Senate that this legislation has room to move. Both Democratic senators who voted yes were careful with their language afterward. Senator Gallego stated directly that the committee vote does not guarantee a floor vote, that the ethics provisions remain the single toughest outstanding issue, and described that negotiation as sitting at the 99-yard line. Close, not finished. The bill survived, but it arrived at the finish line of this stage with open questions still on the table. But this is the part almost nobody is sitting with. Those open questions are not footnotes, they are the story. Let me take each one seriously. The bill that cleared the Senate Banking Committee now needs to be merged with a companion version that advanced out of the Senate Agriculture Committee. 2 separate committees worked on this legislation because the jurisdictional question at its core, which federal agency oversees which digital assets, crosses into both banking and commodities regulation. Merging those 2 texts will require resolving the points of disagreement between them before any unified bill can reach the full Senate floor. On the broader timeline, analysis from people closest to the process suggests a full Senate floor vote could come roughly a month after the committee markup, placing it around mid to late June. President Trump has said repeatedly that he would like to sign the Clarity Act into law by July 4th. The people most directly involved in getting it there have described that timeline as achievable, while also being honest that it requires no major new obstacles emerging over the next several weeks. Politics, as was demonstrated on Wednesday night and Thursday morning, does not always cooperate with calendars. The ethics provisions need their own moment of resolution. Additional Democratic support from Senators Warner, Cortez Masto, and Warnock will depend significantly on whether law enforcement concerns can be addressed. Specifically, the argument that certain provisions in the bill could limit prosecutors' ability to go after bad actors who use blockchain infrastructure for criminal purposes. That is a real concern from a real constituency, and it is not yet resolved. Now, here's where things get serious for the part nobody covered, but here is the part of Thursday's story that I think most of the coverage walked past entirely. The most important sentence spoken at that entire markup did not come from a Republican, did not come during the vote itself, and was not about the bill's passage. Cody Carbone, the CEO of the Digital Chamber, the trade association representing the U.S. crypto industry in Washington, was asked directly after the vote whether the Clarity Act, if it passes the full Senate and gets signed into law, would be enough. His answer was no. The Clarity Act is a critical first step, he said. It builds the market structure framework. But without tax legislation to complement it, a significant portion of the innovation this bill is supposed to unlock will continue to happen outside the United States. Tokens will still be issued in jurisdictions with more favorable tax treatment. Companies will continue to structure their operations offshore to avoid the tax complexity and uncertainty that currently surrounds digital asset transactions in the U.S. If the stated goal is to make America the global crypto capital, as President Trump has said explicitly, then a comprehensive framework is needed across capital markets regulators, prudential regulators, including the FDIC and the Federal Reserve, and the tax environment. That statement came from the person who has spent months inside these negotiations. It was not a criticism of the Clarity Act, it was a map of what comes after it. And this is where the story becomes dangerous to oversimplify. Now, let me bring this to ground level, because the policy language sometimes obscures what this actually means for a person watching from the outside. Imagine you are a mid-sized bank or fintech company. Your technology team has demonstrated what blockchain infrastructure could do for your operations: faster settlement, lower transaction costs, access to new customer populations, but your legal team has also shown you the exposure. If you integrate XRP into your payment rails and the regulatory environment changes, if the next director of the SEC takes the position that those assets were never legally compliant, every transaction your institution processed becomes a potential liability. Every single one. The scale of that exposure is precisely why institutions have not committed. Not indifference to the technology, calculated legal risk that they were not willing to absorb. What the Clarity Act does, even in its current form with items still unresolved, is begin to convert that calculation. Banks and credit unions are now explicitly named in the amended text as authorized to engage with digital assets. That statutory language creates a foundation that regulatory guidance alone could never provide, because it cannot be reversed by a single appointment. Brad Garlinghouse, who runs Ripple, has said publicly that the Clarity Act would fundamentally change what Ripple does day to day. The company built its entire operational structure around years of legal conflict with the SEC and around global regulatory uncertainty. A clear federal statute opens a far less obstructed path for Ripple and its partners to build relationships with US banks, fintechs, and payment processors that have been avoiding XRP entirely due to legal risk. It creates a cleaner route for XRP-based products, liquidity services, on-demand settlement, RLUSD, and XRP rails to operate under a framework that every counterparty can reference and rely on. Now here's where things get serious for the broader ecosystem, and this structural benefit is not limited to one asset. Analysts and observers cited in Thursday's discussion highlighted Solana, Chainlink, and Ethereum alongside XRP as digital assets whose ecosystems would move forward more decisively with statutory clarity in place. Tokenization of real-world assets broadly, DeFi infrastructure, and the new banks that have been waiting to issue stablecoins under the Genius Act, signed into law separately, all sit in the same queue, waiting for the same gate to open. Think about what this means if you are someone who has spent years building a position in this space while the people around you questioned every step. You researched the institutional thesis when others dismissed it. You watched regulatory battles that most retail investors never followed. You understood the difference between what a regulator says and what Congress writes into law. If you have been holding through the skepticism and the noise, what happened Thursday is relevant to you specifically, because the structural development you understood was coming has now cleared its most visible legislative obstacle, while most of the people who doubted you are still not paying close attention to what is actually happening. But this is the part almost nobody is asking. But here is the unanswered question that Thursday's vote did not resolve. If the Clarity Act passes the full Senate and reaches the president's desk, but the tax legislation that Cody Carbone identified as equally essential never arrives, does the US still fall short of global crypto leadership even after winning this regulatory fight? And who is building the second half of that framework? Let me pull everything together now and show you the full picture. The story of Thursday's Senate Banking Committee vote is not simply that a bill passed committee. The story is that a bill nearly didn't pass, that it survived because of a chaotic real-time negotiation conducted in a side room while the formal hearing proceeded next door. That staff were handwriting amendment language and lawmakers were finalizing positions at 10:29 a.m., 1 minute before the gavel came down. Four things are developing in the US crypto regulatory environment at the same time: legislative clarity, regulatory clarity, banking clarity, and accounting clarity. The people closest to this space have described that convergence as genuinely unprecedented. Most industries going through regulatory restructuring deal with one front at a time. All four moving together represent something different in scale and in meaning. When any one of those clarities arrives, the industry benefits. When all four arrive within the same window, the structural foundation changes. And what happens next changes everything for the patient investor. But the synthesis also requires holding the full picture clearly. The ethics provisions are not done. A full Senate floor vote will require securing additional Democratic support, which depends on resolving law enforcement concerns and finalizing what Senator Gallego called the toughest outstanding issue. The two committee versions of the bill need to be merged. The July 4th deadline is real, but not guaranteed. And even after the Clarity Act reaches the president's desk, the tax framework that Cody Carbone identified as equally essential for keeping token issuance onshore has not been introduced yet. What the patient investor now has is a clearer and more accurate map of where the process actually stands. Not a headline vote count. A real understanding of what passed, what was left out, what was agreed to in principle but not in writing, and what the next critical legislative piece looks like. That level of informed clarity is what separates someone who is thinking precisely about this moment from someone who is reacting to price movements and general headlines. The thesis has not changed. The structural work is real, and it is moving forward. The Clarity Act is necessary. It is also not the whole answer. Both of those things are true at the same time, and understanding both of them is the position that the patient long-term investor is in after Thursday. And this is where the story becomes dangerous to underestimate. The people who tracked this process all the way through, the near collapse on Wednesday night, the chaos in the anteroom on Thursday morning, the precise language of what was included and what was deliberately left out, are positioned to understand what comes next more clearly than those following only the surface-level developments. And that matters more than most people realize right now. The institutional players who watched this vote did not see a 15-9 bipartisan margin and decide to wait for the floor vote before reviewing their positioning. They saw the handwritten amendments, the side room negotiation, and the substance of what was preserved and what was traded, and they understood that the bill that emerged from Thursday is the bill that the rest of the legislative process will refine, not replace. The compliance departments at the major banks are reading the marked up text right now. The mandate amendment committees at the major asset managers are evaluating which provisions affect their internal eligibility screens for XRP exposure. The product teams at the major ETF issuers are running the post-markup deployment scenarios against the language that survived. The market that you see on the chart in the days after Thursday is the market that exists before that institutional reading has fully translated into capital deployment. The market that exists after the institutional reading is the market that the chart will eventually reflect. That gap between the institutional reading and the public reaction is the structural opportunity that the patient investor has been positioned for. Not because of speculation, because of preparation. Bills written in marble move slowly. Bills written by hand on the morning of the vote move history. Thursday was history written in handwriting, and the ink hasn't dried yet. After everything we walked through today, which unresolved piece concerns you more going forward? The ethics provisions or the missing tax legislation? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening, go ahead and like it. It helps this channel reach more people who need to see this. And subscribe so you do not miss the next breakdown, because when the merged bill text is published, when the Senate floor vote schedule is announced, when the tax legislation Cody Carbone described as essential gets introduced, and when the institutional reading of Thursday's marked up text begins translating into observable capital flows, my analysis drops within hours of each event. Share this with someone in your circle who is only following domestic crypto news and has no idea what is actually happening on the legislative timeline. Stay informed, stay positioned. I will see you in the next video.